I'm Shantaria Charleston, Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Housing Assistance Council. We are a national nonprofit focused on building affordable homes in stronger communities across rural and tribal America. And here at HAC, we increasingly tap rural design and creative placemaking to forward our work. We really learn from our many local partners along the way. It is with the support from the National Endowment of the Arts that HAC has carried out the Citizens Institute on Rural Design for almost 6 years. The Citizens Institute on Rural Design, or what we affectionately refer to as CERD, it is a leadership initiative of the National Endowments of the Arts and really focuses on communities with populations of 50,000 or less. CERD's goal is to enhance the quality of life and economic vitality of rural America through planning, design, and creative placemaking. CERD is explicitly designed to empower local communities to capitalize on unique local and regional assets to guide both its civic development and future design of their own communities. The CERD program goals broadly include building design capacity in rural areas to plan comprehensive revitalization strategies, introducing creative placemaking, arts, culture, and design strategies as drivers of economic development in rural America. It also seeks to facilitate a network of rural communities for design idea exchanges and peer learning. And last but certainly not least, preparing communities to be ready and competitive for arts and design related state and federal funding opportunities. Again, welcome to Design and Disaster Planning for Rural Communities Part 2. If you missed Part 1, no worries. You are able to view it by visiting the CERD website, www.rural-design.org. You'll find the link to the recording in the Learn section under the Webinars tab. So today's webinar builds on Part 1, which is intended to demystify the disaster planning process by bringing together innovative disaster resiliency and response practitioners who center design, arts, and culture in their work. That said, I'll move into introducing our illustrious panel of speakers for today's webinar. First up, we have Benje Feehan. He's the Executive Director of Building Communities Workshop, or what we call BC. Benje is an architect, an artist, and educator. His work focuses on the union of creative practices and a deep understanding of place to dismantle systemic injustices evident in the built environment. Benje has worked with residents and clients to design and consult socially and environmentally responsible architectural solutions for some of our city's most pressing issues. This work has been recognized with numerous awards and honors, including LEED Platinum certification, multiple AIA Design Awards, National AIA and HUD Design Awards, as well as the Rudy Bruner Silver Medal. Our second presenter is Frandelle Gerard. She's an advisory council member of the Virginia Islands Architectural Center for Built Heritage and Crafts. Frandelle is a St. Croix community cultural and social justice activist who serves as the Executive Director of Cretan Heritage and Nature Tourism. I see something in the chat. I'm trying to make sure I'm keeping up, so sorry about that. Frandelle is also an advisory council member of the Virginia Islands Architectural Center for Built Heritage and Crafts and a member of the St. Croix Foundation's nonprofit consortium. She is the daughter of a generational Virgin Islands family, and Frandelle often uses her voice to advocate for the community in matters of cultural authenticity, environmental justice, and economic sustainability. Our third presenter that we have today joining us is Kelly Johnston. He is the Operations Director for Community Wildfire Planning Center. Kelly has been involved in the field of wildland fire management since the beginning of his career in the early 90s as a seasonal firefighter for the British Columbia Forest Service. Kelly focuses his expertise in community wildfire risk assessment, wildland-urban interface mitigation solutions, fire behavioral analyst, prescribed fire and fire ecology. Kelly also works collaboratively with all levels of government, community stakeholders, residents, and Indigenous partners through key roles and projects that span from local to international levels. So I want to say thank you to our illustrious panel of presenters. And at this time, I will hand it over to Benje to start us off. Benje, take it away.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. How's that? All good? Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. So again, yeah, my name is Benje Feehan. I'm an architect with BC Workshop, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about Rapido. First off, I must acknowledge that I am just representing a multitude of individuals and organizations that worked on this initiative for a number of years. I've got them listed here. We've got Come Dream, Come Build, or CDCB in Brownsville, a nonprofit developer. We've got ourselves, Texas Houses, who deal strongly in affordable housing law, Arise and Lupe, local community organizers in the Lower Rio Grande Valley, and Texas A&M Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center was also strongly involved in this. And you'll have to excuse me, I've been a little unwell this week. So I'm going to go into Rapido. I'm just going to leave this slide up here for a second. All of these resources available in their entirety and full depth are available at rapidorecovery.org if anybody's interested, and we can certainly get that in the chat. But I'm going to talk about Rapido, which we actually started in 2014. This slide used to state 2008 to 2014. In response to Hurricane Dolly that hit the Texas Gulf Coast. I updated it this week to current because these are all still issues, obviously, that many rural communities are facing. So if we're going to talk about Rapido, what is it? Rapido is a housing model. It's a design and construction methodology. It's a system guide that includes a technical guide which sets up the process to implement a redesigned disaster reconstruction system, and it's a policy guide as well. BC, we are community designers or 501c3. We were very engaged in the development of, say, the technical and kind of architectural product, as well as moving in towards partnering with Texas Houses on the policy side. So I'm kind of, my wheelhouse is a little bit around the design component and the process of how we got there. But Rapido is a wraparound disaster recovery system or model that involves kind of an architectural component for its delivery. So if we look at the existing model, or at least when we looked at it in 2014, we started to see federal response. So funds and aid coming down from the federal level down into the neighborhood level, right? And so kind of that trickle down effect, and we begin to acknowledge or recognize, as I know many communities do, how long that takes, and in terms of the overall recovery funding, how little of it actually hits the ground in that timely manner. So if we were looking at the Rapido model, what we're really trying to do is invert that. And I would just start off with a very simple premise. When we looked at this, we were like, how do we replace the FEMA trailer, right? If we did just like as a hypothesis, just how do you replace that kind of federal response of the FEMA trailer hitting the ground, and began to unpack the whole system around that and the timing of how those things happened. So really, the Rapido model is looking to invert everything, flip it on its head, see that aid and those funds hit the ground faster in a more timely fashion that begins to, build local economies as quickly, rebuild local economies as quickly as possible following that disaster. So if we're kind of, the big question is, how do we get from this, or housing conditions that we're all really familiar with in rural communities, how do we get from this through a process that looks like this in terms of redesigning this system to a new type of product, or a new, a rebuilt home as quickly as possible following a disaster? Just to ground everything, and for the sake of everybody on the call, when we began the Rapido kind of inquiry project, whatever you want to call it, it was specifically in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. And so a number of our partners at that point are or were still located in Brownsville, Lower Rio Grande Valley, moving up through Hidalgo County, Starr County, et cetera. And so this just kind of as a grounding, the Lower Rio Grande Valley, I believe up until maybe just a couple of years ago, Cameron County in the LRGV, outside of the reservations, was the poorest county in the States. Now, things have changed, right? You've got some guy shooting off missiles and space rockets from the beach, right? So the economies have started to change over the last couple of years. But just as a grounding, when it comes to under-resourced rural communities, this is, this represents those places across our country really well. So as a grounding, this is where we started. As you can see, everything's in a floodplain. And again, this was really a response to the hurricane in 2008. So what does the process look like for us as we begin to dive into it? Now, as part of, BC's process, we've always, rooted in place, rooted in community, through our mission. So, we start talking to folks. We have these goals that we know we need to set, achievements we need to make. And so, all the stakeholder meetings, Lupe and Arise, were just absolutely critical and essential in bringing people around this conversation to share their stories, share their local expertise, share the heartbreak that a lot of families that we're all familiar face with post-disaster. So out of that, these kind of strategies began to get teased out. So we're looking at, social equity being a key driver. This thing had to be rapidly deployable. And how do we construct it, right? It has to have this level of constructability. So within social equity, we need to provide resident choice, right? Just can't show up and dump a product on folks. So there has to be resident choice. We have to stimulate the local economy, and we have to keep communities intact. We're getting into rapid deployment. The things have to be easy to build, right? Again, we're looking to stimulate local economy. These have to be built in the economy. They have to be adaptable. They have to maximize local labor. And then in terms of constructability, maximizing and utilizing local skills and practice, durable, mobile, right? Because we knew we wanted to move these things. And my slideshow has decided that it does not. There we go. So kind of beginning to further unpack, what is this product or what does this thing look like that needs to achieve these things? Again, continue, through the stakeholder meetings, community engagement, participatory design, however you would like to frame that in your world, but just really sitting down and visiting with folks and understanding if we're gonna look to provide this temporary to permanent solution, what are the factors that we have to take into place? Like, what can we deliver early versus what can come later? So, within that temporary solution, what's the, I hate to say it, but what's the minimum we need to provide to get folks back on their property, back in their home, back in their neighborhoods and their communities? And then how does it begin to grow or expand later? So these are just some examples of a number of outputs from community design sessions, just looking at particular lots, different programs of a home, and then kind of the quantification of that within the activity set. Sorry, excuse me for a second. Still trying to get over this. I'm sorry. And then the quantification of those programs. So what does that begin to look like in terms of a process? So what we have here is a natural disaster that occurs. And if we begin to look at a few of those different those streams of work, we've got offsite construction, on-site construction, prepping the site again, and then the outreach team. And how these begin to come together. So we have an offsite construction of this product, and we have the on-site preparation of the site for it, the outreach teams on the ground, and they begin to come together, kind of focusing on that site and the deployment of this core. And what we developed was this piece of a home. It's called the core, and it provides all those essential components required for a final home. So within the core, we start delivering flexible living space. It can double as additional sleeping areas, private bedroom, a private bathroom, as well as, excuse me, as well as all the critical utilities, so like primary electrical panel, plumbing manifold, all that critical infrastructure, clean water. Once the electricity is back on, it's ready to power that up. So the big idea here is that we deliver this temporary core that becomes part of the permanent solution. The core was about 12 by 36 square feet. We designed it to be flat pack prefabbed, locally on site by local labor. So there's nothing fancy about this. It's like 2x4s and plywood, right? So it's made of materials that everybody's, like builders, folks in all of our communities are used to working with. So again, the big idea here is that disaster hits, these things are able to be built and constructed quickly and swiftly and moved out to folks' sites once that site clearing's taken place and become part of the permanent home. So we get this temporary unit that's delivered, gets people back on site. We get an expansion based on insurance qualifications, what have you, what it might be, based on family size, how big does the final home need to be, and then that becomes the final home. Looking at it in another way, we get this core, and then we end up with a home that's built around that, the final home for residents on their site. And then if we start to
Actually, the boring work of hanging all this metal on the wall, and then it was like getting it. Yeah.
Oh, Omar?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could mute your speakers,
Assuming
please.
he cut it.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Benji. I gave him a minute to get another sip of water.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. So, beginning to look at what that looks like across a neighborhood scale, right? So there's a disaster, but providing the family's choice and how this can be implemented at a larger scale, just starting with this kind of small idea of a core and then that temporary to permanent model. So in real life, there were a number of these prototyped in the Valley and in Houston. So in real life, this is what that starts to look like. So again, there's these flat back panels that are constructed, that stood up on site, and you end up with the core. And then the permanent home is constructed around that, which delivers, a final home for the residents. Here's a look at the interior of some of the prototype cores that were delivered. And then the policy implications. And again, I will apologize in advance. I was not fully involved in the policy portion of this effort. But we do know that, from our efforts here, we have an outreach and public participation, including case management and social services, plus design and construction, assessment, design decisions and construction, leads to a pre-disaster planning. And I think that's really where, as anybody who's worked in the space knows, what it really comes down to is the planning and the pre-recovery efforts that need to take place. And so here's just a diagram of how that looked for us here in Texas, and taking that to the house for the pre-recovery efforts. Again, all available on rapidorecovery.org, but just kind of looking at taking that all the way through for policy implementation. So Rapido as a model is really made up of, these policy and pre-recovery planning and implementation, the design and building process, and it's about building and rebuilding resilient communities post-disaster. And so we kind of, where does that leave us now? The Rapido work was a fantastic idea. It's been prototyped numerous times. All of the organizations that I introduced at the beginning have spent their own money on trying to advance it, and kind of where does that leave us today? And what we've been able to do is, through shifting a lens a little bit, and that's hard to say, right? It's really hard to sit here and say Rapido was really hard to fund. It was really hard to bring money around the implementation of that and the systemizing of that system. that's been our reality, right? We never really got it off the ground outside of prototyping and this great big idea and taking it to the state legislator. It was actually never implemented, which I think is always really hard for people to say. But what BC and CDCB's been able to do over the last few years is kind of, I don't want to say shift the lens, but maybe frame it in somewhat of a different manner, right? And so what we've kind of said is we have a disaster, right, in our communities across the country. We have a man-made disaster in regards to affordable housing. And so we began to kind of reframe the, all the learnings and all the fantastic work from all the parties around Rapido, and we began to reposition it like, okay, and then again, this is horrible. It's like, well, was disaster recovery too much of a niche to try to fund, right? Let's blow this thing up and maybe let's come at it through, affordable or attainable housing lens. And so we kind of retooled it a little bit and started looking at it as this affordable housing product. And we were fortunate enough to win the Housing Affordability Breakthrough Challenge that Wells Fargo funded their first round in 2020 or 2021. Enterprise administered it. And we pitched this idea around volumetric prefab, right? And so it's the same thing. It's like we have an issue, right? Whether it's after a flood, a hurricane, or a fire, or whether it's after, decades and generations of systemic racism, we have this issue of inadequate housing in a lot of communities that we all work in and try to see good work done. So we say, okay, we've got an issue. This one we're focusing on here is man-made, but it's completely applicable across the board when you're talking about the type of conditions that so many folks find themselves living in. So it's all the same idea, right? This thing's called Dream Build. But really, you can see all the learnings from Rapido. It starts with a core, or there's a couple of cores that you can start from, and then it grows. I think one of the larger differences is the Rapido model depended on kind of more of a custom design process around that core, whereas Dream Build has developed a series of modules or cores or boxes that kind of plug and play, right? So this little diagram is trying to say, okay, a client might start with an L core, and then they have this selection that they can make of a number of other modules or boxes that can start to plug in and grow around it. So the core starts out very similar to the Rapido core. You've got a private bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom, utility, again, all that primary infrastructure for a little starter home. But then you can begin to add modules or boxes. So you can add the bedroom suite, right? Which is a primary bedroom suite. It's got another bathroom, a walk-in closet. You can add the kid box, which is 2 little bedrooms, 2 little closets. So you could choose to grow your home by just starting with a small little core and then growing it in the future. Or, most of the clients that we've worked with have just selected their final home, 3, 4, 5 boxes, anywhere between, let's say, 600 and 1,500 square feet, depending on their means. So embedded within in this new Dream Build kind of venture is all those same principles of client choice. They have the opportunity to choose their floor plan, paint colors, siding type. We have a porch catalog that's developed. And this is all now happening within like a website, within an app. So it can all come together there. It's linked to financing, mortgage, pre-qualification, and we're currently delivering in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and we were fortunate enough to be funded for a few more years from another institution, and we're beginning to scale that across the country. So it's all offsite manufacturing. We kind of formalized the manufacturing process. We call it the farm, not the factory, because it's just a big shed. Nothing fancy about it, but it's all the same principles: local labor, local materials, stimulating local economy through the production of affordable housing. All the product is state license, so we don't have to mess around with building permits or anything like that for the actual kind of product here. And so again, we're just continuing to learn and speed up efficiencies and produce at a high rate of volume, which means at a lower cost. And then they're delivered on site. Final foundation boxes are delivered. They're all sheetrocked and painted on the inside there. This particular home is getting brick. Otherwise, it would be delivered with its siding on there. And then again, with the kind of wraparound services with our partner, CDCB down in Brownsville, we're just so fortunate. We've been working with them for over 10 years now, but developer, CDFI, they write their own notes. The financing piece is really tight and complete. I know a lot of folks on this call are familiar with CDCB. So that really streamlines it. So really, DreamBuild's trying to control all the facets of the affordable housing delivery, right? From manufacturing all the way through the sale. It doesn't have to, but it has the ability to. And then
Benji, really quick, this is Stephen. Your time is basically up, so I just wanted to see if you could wrap it up pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Last slide.
Last
slide, so perfect timing. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, sure.
So just to circle back around, so we're working with 3 national partners at the moment in terms of scaling up the DreamBuild model, working with WeBuild in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, C&E Homes in Tennessee, and then Frontier Homes in Kentucky. And so if we look at this through all the lenses, right, of providing housing to all folks that need housing, post-disaster, whether man-made or natural, we're starting to get hopeful about this infrastructure that's starting to be built across the country when it comes to the delivery of homes, and then circling back around to, the Rapido model. Like, what is the disaster recovery product within this system that's now in place begin to look like? Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Benji. As we translate over, or we transition over into Frandelle's presentation, if folks have questions, please begin to enter them into the chat box. It's located on the bottom of your screen. And so, Frandelle, we're going to hand it over to you.
I'm going to try, and if all else fails, I'll jump on my phone. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and then let me try and get this to play as a slideshow. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I am the executive director of a group called CHANT, and advisory member to the Virgin Islands Architecture Center for Built Heritage and Crafts, otherwise known as VIAC, and that's how I'll be referring to it. And VIAC is Virgin Islands Built Heritage project that revitalizes our towns, empowers the local community through education, and workforce and cultural economic development. And we're located on the island of St. Croix, and VIAC is focused on the town. Their project is focused on the town of Christiansted. CHANT, just for a little fill-in, we are located in the town of Frederiksted, and our mission is to promote, preserve, and conserve the built and natural environment of St. Croix and to serve as a catalyst for sustainable development. Both of these projects, we are partners. We are centering design, arts, and culture in disaster response, and that wonderful word, resiliency. We do it through multiple modalities, but invigorating career pathways in the traditional building arts is one of our primary goals, preserving local artisanal building skills, and preserving historic African colonial and vernacular buildings. For a little background, that image that you see, the old barracks property is the target property for VIAC restoration. St. Croix has, the Virgin Islands has 4 major national historic districts that have unique cultural narratives about our territory and the Caribbean. Many of our historic structures are aging and subject to the ravages of extreme climate and weather events. We were hit, St. Thomas by Category 5, named Irma in 2017. St. Croix was shortly thereafter hit by Category 5, named Maria. Many of these buildings are government-owned or owned by local families. So VIAC's concept is to create this educational institution. We want to certify students in the building trades and create a pathway to architectural careers, looking at post-secondary school certifications and eventually an associate's program. And we see it as a way to preserve the economy and create a cultural corridor in the downtown Christiansted area. Chant established the Building Arts Institute concept as part of a creative placemaking project, and it's focused on many of the same things, stemming the loss of the traditional art forms, addressing the problems of abandoned and derelict historic buildings in the town of Christiansted, and providing education and certification and training to local residents to be eligible for historic preservation investments. This is a snapshot of the town of Christiansted on your left, and the VIAC project property on the right. Buildings 1 and 2 are the buildings that VIAC has control of. The other buildings on the property are currently under the control of the VI Government Department of Education. As you see, we are in a historic zone, in an enterprise zone, and on a coastline of the harbor. It's a protected harbor in the town of Christiansted. Oops, did I go too fast? So this is what the buildings look like after the disaster and after some street cleanup. These buildings, of course, are historic and date back to the 18th century and are constructed primarily of coral and masonry. This is building 2 after the disaster, and is the first building that is targeted for restoration and occupation as the VIAC Institute. For perspective, the photograph on the right is of the old barracks yard, dating back to about 1890. And on the right is an image of all of the teachers and the principal of the Christiansted High School, which was located at the barracks yard. And this picture dates to 1942. And I'm old enough to be able to name most of the people in the picture. This is the town of Frederiksted, and our target property of the free gun houses in the town of Frederiksted in the Building Arts program. And you may ask why we use the term free gut. Free gut was an area in both of our historic towns established under the Danish colonial rule for free people of color and free Blacks to be able to own land and purchase their own buildings. Number 38 Hospital Street was in the hands of a free Black as early as 1777. The buildings themselves date to about 1805 to 1840. We have partnered with organizations to do traditional training. This is the estate Little Princess property that's owned by the Nature Conservancy, and we were able to do a Hope training program for young people in our community. We trained 5 people. David Gilbert came in, and so we are partnering closely with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to make sure that the trades are continued and proper training is provided to the students. So what are the accomplishments? And you may wonder, how are we responding to climate change and natural disasters. We convened a number of regional professionals, national professionals, international professionals to assist in the design of our programs and our development strategy. Bringing together folks from Denmark, folks from the United States, the American College of the Building Arts, and through this process, we were able to not only document, but engage the community and develop a long-term strategic plan for the project that answers the needs as identified by the community. All of this has come through community activated projects, including a town planning process. We anticipate that the first phase of this project will begin shortly, as we just secured a 50-year lease last week from the government of the Virgin Islands to begin and it'll enable us to begin the restoration of Building 1 and to do some stabilization. Additionally, we've been collecting the oral histories of people in the community as it connects to that building and its historical uses through their lifetimes. So we've done a feasibility study. We're looking at creating programs in partnership with established organizations in the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and the United States, and Denmark. And this is a 10-year project. And our goal is to have a thriving campus and resource center in downtown Christiansted that meets the needs of the people here in the Virgin Islands. Now we get to talk about the thing nobody likes to talk about. This is a schematic drawing done by Danish architectural students in partnership with Gerville Larsen, who is a member of the VIAC team. He's native-born Virgin Islander and esteemed historic architect. And this envisions the entire project with the front buildings, buildings 1 and 2, to be used by VIAC, and eventually the other buildings to be used by the organization. We're talking about stone masonry construction. We're talking about needing $12 to $15 million to fund this entire project, with the goal being that the students will be trained and on island, and we will be able to develop on island capacity for the preservation and restoration of historical buildings here in the Virgin Islands. Our urban centers are particularly susceptible to storms, and urban decay has accelerated. It's expensive to build, renovate, retrofit, and preserve the built environment. And our goal is to be able to do that in a way that is responsive to climate change. Clearly, these buildings have stood the test of climate change. We are relying on a number of different inputs, including the Urban Land Institute report on Christiansted, the St. Croix Historic Attraction Study, and the Virgin Islands Economic Development Authority's 2040 Vision 2040, which was a project commissioned through the Office of the Governor as well. This has been possible because of the tremendous team that VIAC has built under leadership of Mary Dima, who is the president of VIAC. This is the board and advisors and the consultants that are working from Puerto Rico to Denmark to New York to South Carolina. And I'd like to say that what we're looking at doing is reuse of historic properties, pushing forward sustainability, and using ancient techniques and ancestral practices here in the territory that have withstood the test of time and have been able to respond to the impacts of climate change and natural disasters because of the traditional building methods. So I thank you and look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much, Frandelle. Thank you. Just a quick reminder, if you are formulating your questions, please start entering them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of our wonderful presentations today. And so that said, I'm going to pass it over to Kelly.
Thank you, and I'll just get this over to sharing my screen. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Kelly Johnston. I'm the Operations Director for the Community Wildfire Planning Center. And I'm going to talk about the use of land use planning to increase resiliency to wildfire and therefore contributing to sustainability. Overall, what we are trying to do is reduce what we see in this photo here, multiple structures lost and therefore creating larger impacts on communities. This is a growing phenomenon that we're seeing with the significant rise in wildfire impacts on communities around the globe and across North America, and an increasing number of homes and other structures being lost to wildfire. So first, what I want to do is actually just take a look at the term wildland-urban interface so everyone's on the same page. Many of you may think of wildfire as fire that burns in the trees and the natural areas outside of a city or a town. But in fact, the wildland-urban interface, or this space where the built environment meets that wildland environment, extends quite a distance into the urban town center and includes areas in the general residence areas and the suburban areas of many human establishments. This is largely due to the ability of these wildfires to transport embers for significant distances, up to a few miles to several miles, and for the ongoing structure-to-structure ignition that occurs after a wildfire is initially impinged on a development. So what we're going to do is look at why that happens, what the problem is, and what we can do about it. So a fellow named Dr. Jack Cohen from the U.S. Forest Service, who's now retired, developed this concept of the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, disaster sequence. And the idea is that a wildland fire escapes what we call initial attack. Initial attack is where we send firefighters out to stop a fire while it's very small. In fact, we're very successful with this around the world. We're typically holding about a 95% success rate for stopping fires at for 10 acres or less, or 4 hectares. But that 5% of the fires actually is the ones that's causing us problems, and those big fires you see on the news, where they start to involve structures and infrastructure. We'll call them built fuels. And that turns into what we call an urban conflagration, where there's multiple simultaneous structure ignitions at once. The photo here is a place called Slave Lake, Alberta in Canada. And there was several hundred structures lost within a matter of just a few hours during that fire. And several hundred of those structures were on fire at the same time. This is a problem because it actually exceeds our fire suppression resources that most of our towns and cities are based around. They're typically based around putting 1 or 2 house fires out at any given time, not multiples of dozens or 10 or hundreds of structures at the same time. So just a reminder, that's even with 95 to 98% success in wildfire suppression at that initial attack stage. we're seeing increasingly the fire resources being overwhelmed and increasingly wildland urban interface disasters occurring globally. So you may say, well, you know, that is sad that we lose homes, we lose structures to fire, but how does that impact the community? It's actually much larger than that. We do see these immediate impacts. As I said, we have the challenge of this exceedance of fire suppression capabilities. Unfortunately, we also see the loss of human life or injury. And of course, we see significant infrastructure damage and loss, as well as significant building damage and loss. But the spin-offs and probably the larger impacts from that are the larger economic losses of tax base, for instance, the cost of rebuilding, the social impacts that occur. We've had reports of many fires of things like a significant increase in domestic violence, in substance use, and PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, occurring in large parts of the populations that are affected. We see significant health impacts, in largely with smoke. We've seen there's reports of medical doctor visits increasing by up to 75% during wildfire smoke impacts for respiratory concerns. And we see a lot of ecological and biophysical impacts as well. So our fires are burning a lot hotter than they did historically, and in ecosystems that didn't develop with that in response to that type of fire intensity. And then finally, the term of where there's fire, there's typically flood is pretty common. We have compounding natural disasters, so we have these high intensity fires burning across the landscape, and in the rains coming and causing slides and flooding because the vegetation isn't there to intercept the precipitation. So some pretty significant post-fire long-term impacts that lots of times we don't really think of, but I just want you to frame your minds around that when we start talking about structure loss or continue to talk about structure loss. I'm going to talk a little bit about wildfire risk and how we view it. Fire people really like their triangles. You'll see a lot of triangles. I think that's because we can only count to 3, maybe, I'm not sure. I'll focus you on this wildfire risk triangle, and it incorporates the likelihood of a fire occurring. Typically in North America, fires are ignited by either lightning or human-caused fires. And it's usually on a large scale, about 50-50. As we get closer to developed areas, the human-caused portion goes up. It can go up to as much as 80 to 100% of fire cause. And then we have the intensity portion, which is really how hot the fire burns. If you want to relate that to something visual in your minds, that would be how tall the flames are. The flame length is directly related to the intensity of the fire. And the intensity of the fire typically puts out more heat, creates more embers, and pushes the embers further away from the fire to ignite homes and buildings further downwind. So the likelihood intensity is the hazard or the exposure that we face. And that is, that's related with, as far as risk, to the susceptibility, the things we care about. And in the land use planning world, and particular to this presentation, we're gonna speak on the susceptibility of communities, infrastructure, and structures. I just wanted to call out a special note in the likelihood portion of this is the idea of hazardous land uses and a human ignition component, and those land uses being close by human development. And I'll touch on that a little bit in the next few slides. So really what we're looking at is either hopefully building for resiliency before a fire occurs, or in many of our areas that are already built out or well on their ways to being built out. If a fire does occur, not letting this happen again through rebuilding for resiliency to wildfire. And so this is actually a photo from the Sleepy Hollow fire in Wenatchee, Washington. This home is a home that was rebuilt. The fire burnt down this home and most of the homes along the row that you see in this photo. And they did have some measures in place to rebuild the homes with resiliency so they were less susceptible to fire ignition and those pesky little embers. So hopefully we won't see these homes being lost to fire again. So when we talk about that wildfire resiliency idea, we've formulated a way to sort of visually show all of the components of that. And this is through the fire adapted wheel, we call it. And this was developed as part of the Fire Adapted Communities Network. And so this wheel incorporates all of the components that are important in implementing in wildfire resiliency and fire adaptation. I'll focus on the regulations, policies, and plans chunk of the pie here. So the spoke up in the, I guess it's the top right-hand corner as you see it, or maybe it's the left hand if it's flipped around for you. And so we'll focus on that for the rest of the presentation. And just so you know, though, that's not the only piece of the pie that has to be dealt with to achieve wildfire resiliency. There's all these other pieces. So starting off with how do we decide how to incorporate or support land use planning into wildfire risk reduction? Well, we do a risk map or a hazard map, and we use that hazard or risk map to delineate the landscape as far as degrees of exposure or degrees of risk, depending on what you're talking about. And then using that as a decision support tool for our mitigations in response to that risk or exposure. We also want to, as I spoke on a little earlier, look at any hazardous or vulnerable land uses that surround or are adjacent to the communities. Things like sawmills or gas stations as being hazardous land uses. These are typically, any industrial land use is typically more likely to be an ignition source for fire. And when it spreads beyond that particular land use, into the wildlands or the vegetation, an ignition source for wildfire. So the relationship of where the community is laid out or where vulnerable or susceptible values that we have, like our homes, are with relationship to these land uses is important. And then on the other end of the scale, we also look at the highly vulnerable components of the community, like hospitals, care homes, schools, low-income housing, places where the impacts of fire will either be a very large challenge for people to respond to that very quickly. And with response, I mean usually evacuation, or respond to it in the long term, meaning their ability to recover economically. I was very encouraged to see the two presentations that preceded this one that really focused on that recovery of post-disaster, which really was exciting to see. So, and then surrounding the city, we also typically, in these environments, we also typically have what we call greenways, green belts, and open spaces surrounding and within the city. And these can be used as, in many ways, you may have heard these being referred to as possible buffers for wildfire. I think the important take home for this is we can use specific land uses on this, at this level to incorporate in supporting that buffer from wildfire. For example, if grazed rangelands are properly managed with the livestock that are using them, they can be set up in a condition that they won't support aggressive wildfire, as with irrigated agricultural crops and even urban greenways. If the fuel arrangements or the vegetation arrangements in those greenways are of such that they don't support aggressive wildfire, they can be used as buffers. And of course, you know, the planned placement of things like city parks and irrigated recreation areas can be incorporated into components of those buffers to between the wildlands and reducing aggressive wildfire. So going down to a little bit of smaller scale, we talk about the site design and the layout of communities and all sorts of things that are incorporated in that, like the access, the egress, the water supply, setbacks, and even the relationship or the density of structures and the distance between structures. So an example of this is from a fire in Colorado Springs called the Wallow Canyon Fire. The Colorado Springs fire showed an example of where fire was moving up the green belts within or greenways within the urban areas, and without setbacks on these slopes. Many of the homes that had inadequate setback unfortunately were destroyed, but as you see with this circled area, there are homes that had a significant or reasonable amount of setback that protected the home from the heat and flames of the fire burning up the greenways. When we talk about access and egress, we want to make sure that our big fire trucks can get into those communities while people are trying to get out at the same time. So we have to make sure that the roads are wide enough for that, and that we have roads that more than one access out of the community. So we have, and we don't have things like unknown dead ends that people can get stuck at. Some other things that come into play are things like bridges that people have into their yards and bridges in the communities. The responding agencies with the fire apparatus drive big, heavy vehicles, and if they're not supported by those bridges, they can't get in, and they may choose not to go in because of that. So we have to make sure that the bridges, the roads, and anything else are wide enough and built heavy enough to support these big heavy apparatus. And finally, we need to make sure that we have signage in these communities to that's non-combustible and reflective, so firefighters responding from other areas where they're not so familiar with the response area know how to get around and can see that in the dark and smoky environment of a wildfire. And added on to that, ensuring that an adequate water supply in the community is present. And when we talk about an adequate water supply, for each individual home, we're looking at things like 250 gallons a minute of water. The fire engines that go into the communities carry a limited amount of water with them that can be used up within minutes, and they need to plug into these hydrants or other water sources to continue protecting homes. So there's many types of water supply in those areas that can be useful. All of them, we have to make sure that they do provide continuous water supply, even with the power loss. When we get down to the actual structures themselves, the same Dr. Jack Cohn has come up with a home ignition zone or structure ignition zone concept.
Kelly, this is Stephen. I just wanted to ask you to wrap it up as soon as possible, so we have time for some questions too.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. So we had structure ignition concept and home ignition concept that actually has proven that the distance around a home and the home itself and the conditions of that home are in a situation that can not support wildfire. And then finally, what we want to look at is that overlapping arrangement between the homes and their home ignition zones or their structure ignition zones. Recognizing that if they do overlap, we have to make sure all of these homes are meet all of the same conditions within those circles. So I'll leave it at that, and we can wrap it up for questions.
All right, thank you so very much, Kelly. We appreciate that. As we move into the Q&A portion of our webinar today, please, if you have questions, enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We also want to remind those folks that are in the third cohort, once we end in the next 15 minutes, if you guys would please hang on to the line. We have some additional information that we want to make sure that you have before we end the call today. But the first question is for Benje, and Sabine wants to know, are the Rapido or Dream Build homes designed with a focus on longevity, sustainability, or is the focus on quick rebuilding? I think you addressed this, but if you could more formally respond to the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. When Rapido first started, we had pretty much adopted LEED-like internal practices. We delivered a few LEED homes. We kind of had a LEED performance spec that we were bringing across everything we were working on. The Dream Build product, excuse me, which is actually in production at the moment, is all the modules are built to enterprise green community standards. So that's kind of the metrics that we're using at the moment for water consumption, energy resources, indoor air quality, those kinds of things. And then in terms of, say, a resilience component, if you notice all the Rapido product at first, pier and beam, concrete piers, really easy to elevate homes beyond that base floodplain elevation. With similar principles in the Dream Build product. Structural engineering from a wind standpoint, we're working on the coastline, so everything's engineered beyond code. Code minimums 140 to 150 miles per hour down there, but then there's actually additional engineering required because we're moving them and they have different loads on them based on being moved. So the structural engineering exceeds the code requirements there.
Terry, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Oh, the dreaded mute button. Thank you. The next question up is for Frandelle. Frandelle, Courtney wants to know if you can say more about the youth engagement and training process, like who are they, how they are recruited, things like that. Just a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this summer, VIAC will have its first short course program engaging youth. They're working with a cohort that's high school and college. The high schoolers, they're particularly targeting so that they can create that feeder in for the post-secondary training. What we've done here at Chant with the Building Arts Institute is we've targeted traditionally high-risk, at-risk community members between the ages of 18 and 30. Most are high school graduates, but providing them with the opportunity for the skills training. So we anticipate that the Building Arts Institute at Chant will create a feeder system for VIAC as they stand up the more advanced courses at the post-secondary level. So we're really looking at that 18 to 30 overall group.
All right.
Building that pipeline from high school or, you know, kind of pre-degree up through. So you really, not only do you engage people early, but you also get them and get them to stay, you know, kind of give them, I imagine there's a great retention component to that idea.
Absolutely. And our experience has been, we started our programming using a traditional European apprenticeship program model. And the majority, we had folks that stayed for 3 years, just building on their skill sets until they were able to move on, either doing entrepreneurial work or moving on career paths with contractors.
Thank you, Frandelle. I think the skilled trades is becoming even more important to funders as we look to address this type of work. Our next question is for, let's see, Keelan wants to know, it looks like a question for, oh no, question for Kelly. Kelly, can you say more about the role of community members in the planning process, or who you work with in planning for wildland urban fire safety?
Yeah, of course. First, so it really does amount to a cultural change with the and a shift in thought for the individual homeowners and the community members themselves to make the change. Who we typically work with the Community Wildfire Planning Center is the local governments and state governments to help facilitate that cultural shift through policies and other programs that are implemented. But it really is a grassroots. It ends up being, you know, the ownership, the people on the ground that own the properties. It's up to them to make the changes and from the bottom up.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. Our next question is from Keelan. And this question is for Benje, I'm assuming. And so Keelan's very curious about the potential for cost savings with the modular or rapido styled homes. Is there data regarding the cost or cost savings? And he's saying maybe could more projects be more competitive and also be flexible for different types of development, plus recovering from disasters?
Yes, or yes to everything. So we've built about 30 homes out of the dream build model, which was kind of the evolution of the Rapido. We've built about 30 homes over the last 15 to 18 months. And they're currently for sale. CDCB is selling them. Big official launch is actually next week. But yeah, so the cores at the moment are selling to folks in the Valley for $65,000. And then the boxes that you add on to them are somewhere around $30,000, a little more, a little less, depending on which box you buy. So yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea, right? Is that these things are competitive within the market, and not even within the market, right? Like actually filling a need that that isn't being met at the moment. You know, like community development corporations really struggle to deliver affordable housing without subsidy, and I think this model's trying to really have a good crack at that. Is like, how do we do this given the acknowledgement that subsidy will end eventually, right? So yeah, and in terms of the models for other development, yeah, absolutely. We actually just submitted a LIHTC 9% tax credit application, whenever that was, 6 weeks ago, tax credit, and it was all with the Dream Build product. And so we designed the whole thing out of the Dream Build product, 1, 2, 3, 4-bedroom units, actually in Kingsville, Texas, so about 45 minutes south of Corpus Christi. So yeah, we're really taking this product, this idea, really trying to push it. We're trying to build our own market, right? So if we get the tax credit application, if that's successful, there'll be 150 boxes, right, to put through the factory. And so we're trying to kind of develop our own projects with our own product to continue testing it, trying to improve it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Benje. We've got a question from Delia. Well, hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Lives in New England, so they don't have the same risks of forest fires, so maybe the comment's not relevant, but she would like to know from you, Kelly, can you incorporate dry wells to restore groundwater and try to keep runoff within your immediate environment to prevent the landscaping from getting as dry and being such a fire hazard? It's a lot of...
So ironically, New England and the Northeast of the US actually has some pretty significant fire history. And because of the population density there, you know, every fire is an urban interface fire there. Now, as far as the wells, our biggest challenge there's vegetation moisture is that we're up through most areas across North America, we're in a long-term drought. And we're seeing more also to couple with that, we're seeing some more extreme weather events of it's either hot and dry or it's dumping a lot of moisture on the ground at concentrated moments. So anything to extend that kind of moisture content and capture those intense moisture drops would probably help in maintaining soil moisture and vegetation moisture locally for sure.
Thank you. We've got 2 questions that are up and 3 minutes to go on our time here. And so I'm going to really quickly toss to Frandelle. Frandelle, you mentioned doing the restoration. And so wanted to ask, why choose restoration versus the new building or new construction?
2 reasons, primarily. Thanks for the question. One, the sustainability of restoring existing structures and working with construction models that have held up for 200 years. That's the first. And the second is that we are in a designated historic district. And so the preservation of our culture through our built heritage is as important as the building itself. So it's a 2-part thing. It's social, it's cultural, it's construction. Yeah. Thanks.
2 very important things, Frandelle. 2 very important things. There's a question here that is for Kelly. Kelly, Megan wants to know, does your organization have any helpful guiding documents or models for communities to use as they engage in wildfire planning?
Yes, I actually just put our website in the link, communitywildfire.org, and we actually have a planning hub that has a number of resources in there. There's a map of the US, and you can click on the state, and we have some reference to the resources that are available to each state, and also what we have overall from the Community Wildfire Planning Center.
Thank you so much, Kelly. As we near the end of the hour, I wanted to encourage folks that if you have questions that you are just still percolating on, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A or the meeting chat. We will actually get those questions over to our presenters and be able to share them along with the presentation and the presentation and the recording links on the CERD website. And so with that said, we are at time. Wanted to thank our wonderful presenters today, Frandelle, Benje, Kelly. Thank you so much for the wealth of information that you've shared. And for all of those that are joining us on the call today, thank you for the time you've spent with us. Cohort members, hang on the line. All others, we will see you on the next CERD webinar. Thank you.